Long ago, in a galaxy far away, the Ebionites' holy writings were hidden by God in caves to protect the truth that will set you free. The followers of Jesus would recover them and expose the enemy. Okay, so we've already finished up talking about hold on. We were going over the Clementine homilies, and we showed you the testimony, what looks like testimony of Peter against Paul. And in the course of that testimony, he says, you've basically said I'm condemned and people shouldn't believe me when I speak. And so this is, scholars have admitted, this is a direct reference back to Galatians, where Paul talks about an episode where he condemned Peter because Peter withdrew when people from James at Jerusalem, James being the bishop of Jerusalem, of the church there, the Ebion church. And so when Peter saw James's people coming, he then withdrew from sitting or fellowshipping with Gentiles, presumably at a dinner or some sort of meal, or at least this is how Paul made it sound in his condemnation of Peter. And we're going to show you, this is in a passage in Galatians that we're going to quote. Let's see, here it is. I think it's Galatians chapter 2. Okay, where is that? Here it is, Galatians 2, 11 to 14. So let me read it, and then I'll comment on it. But basically, this is what is the beginning of what caused the antagonism from Peter. Peter is antagonistic, obviously, in the Clementines, and it's a response to this episode, or at least even Peter reading. This is what Paul says he said. He said he publicly scolded Peter, or publicly reproved Peter, and condemned him. So let's read this, and then we'll comment on the propriety of Paul doing that and the antagonism this would have created. But when Cephas, that's Peter, came to Antioch, I resisted him to his face because he stood condemned. Same words we see in the Clementine homily. 17. 12. For before that, certain came from James. He ate with Gentiles. But when they came, those people from James, he drew back and separated himself, fearing that them that were of the circumcision. So basically the, quote, Jewish party. So Paul's talking to them as like they're a different sect of Christianity. 13. And the rest of the Jews dissembled likewise with him, insomuch that even Barnabas was carried away with their dissimulation. So even Barnabas didn't want to fellowship with the Jews, with the Gentiles in this situation. Now, I'm going to say that it probably was because they were eating meat sacrificed to idols. But remember, Paul he said that's okay, you can eat that. That's in 1 Corinthians 8 and 1 Corinthians 10. You only eat if you're going to cause someone who thinks eating meat sacrificed to idols is wrong, and you lead them to be encouraged to do something they think is wrong. But you do it for their conscience and not yours, he says, in 1 Corinthians 10. 14. But when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Cephas, Peter, before them all, so he's doing this publicly, if you, being a Jew, and live as do the Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, how compel you the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? So he's saying Peter somehow had withdrawn from keeping the law of Moses or the customs of the Jewish people, which is, you don't maybe fellowship with Gentiles. So it's not entirely clear what he's condemning him for, but it would be, you can see Peter's response is, I'm not guilty of what you're accusing me of. So he was very defensive, or defending himself as innocent, and he's accusing Paul of saying things to make people not want to take seriously what Peter is recalling as the message of Jesus Christ. Okay, do you remember that? Let me just show you that. Let's go back to the testimony at trial on in the Clementines chapter 17. If you were seen and taught by him, this is Peter in homily 17. Um, oh, wait, let's go down here. If you were not opposed to me, you would not accuse me and revile the truth proclaimed by me, in order that I may not be believed when I state what I myself have heard with my own ears from the Lord, as if I were evidently a person that was condemned and in bad repute. But if you say that I am condemned, you bring an accusation against God, who revealed the Christ to me, and you inveigh against him who pronounced me blessed on account of the revelation. But if indeed you really wish to work in the cause of truth, learn first of all from us what we've learned from him, and become a disciple of the truth, become a fellow worker with us. So he's reproving him for basically taking this Paul taking a defiant stance against them, and believing he can condemn them instead of following them and learning about Christ from them. So this is a serious breach Paul created by condemning Peter, showing he was somehow superior, or pretending to be superior. Now, we need to also know that Paul violated his own principles, and he violated the principles of Jesus in doing what he did. So let's look at that. And you have to know that in the era of Jerome, which is about the late 300s, and that period of time, this whole issue about Peter being condemned by Paul was a big deal. Books were being written about it because it became a big controversy at that time. And Jerome, Augustine was taking Paul's side, and Jerome was saying, hey, wait a minute. Paul was the one who played a hypocrite with getting Timothy circumcised. I could give you that quote if I had to. So he said, he's the one who played the hypocrite, and he had Timothy circumcised for fear of James. That we know, because that Luke even tells us. So, but, we don't really know what's going on with Peter. And more importantly, Jerome says Peter was a pillar of the church, and even Paul recognized that that was true, meaning he has a higher rank than Paul does. So he was not free to condemn somebody who was a superior to him. So Jerome was very much a defender of Peter, and of course Augustine was not. He was taking Paul's side in that situation here. But what does Paul violate here? His own principles. Do not sharply rebuke an older man, but appeal to him as a father. 1 Timothy 5:1. And Peter was older than Paul by all accounts. Also, Paul violates Jesus' command. If your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. Matthew 18, verse 15. Yet, who was right in this public rebuke by Paul or Peter? There is strong reason to believe Paul was wrong, not Peter. Paul was teaching Gentiles that it was permissible to eat meat sacrificed to idols. And we have a whole thing on that. It's definitely true. 1 Corinthians 8, 1 Corinthians 10. The 12 apostles tacitly approved James condemning this in Acts chapter 15. Jesus condemns it multiple times in the book of Revelation. Peter apparently discovered this practice by Paul. Peter then would have appropriately withdrawn from eating with Gentiles under Paul's influence. Peter had to be obedient to Jesus, who had likewise condemned what Paul was permitting. Thus, Paul admits in Galatians that he refused to follow the example of Peter's withdrawal from eating with Gentiles. Peter was probably simply obeying Christ. Now, you as a Christian, I'm talking to you, the audience, must choose. Is Peter as an apostle of Jesus Christ somehow less authoritative than Paul, who Jesus never once appointed as an apostle in 3 vision accounts, if it were the true Jesus? In the 3 appearance accounts, well, yes, there are 3 different accounts of that appearance, Acts 9, 22, and 26. While most commentators assume Paul's in the right on the withdrawal issue, on what basis? Paul say so? Because Paul permits eating meat sacrificed to idols, but the 12 were misled somehow in Acts chapter 12 to prove prohibiting it? The answer to these type of questions is one must not be influenced by Paul's one-sided account. We can see Paul had an eating practice that made dining with Gentiles under his influence impossible. Jewish custom was to avoid violating food laws by simply not eating with Gentiles. This way they would not offend their host by either asking about foods presented or by refusing foods Gentiles offered. This is all that Peter was doing, being polite as well as conscientious. And what's interesting is Peter does ask a good question. Finally, Peter in the Clementine homily speech previously quoted asks his antagonist Paul a blunt question that remains valid even if homily 17 were fictional. Even if we didn't know that it was given by Peter, which I believe it was. That's up to you to decide, but the homilies of Clement were actually originally read in church, just so you know. I found that today. That was part of the discussion of Clement. These were considered, just like the epistles of Clement, these are considered also of equal authority and should be read in church. And this is what people were hearing. And Peter says to Paul, and how did he appear to you when you entertained opinions contrary to his teaching? But if you were seen and taught by him and became his apostle for a single hour, proclaim his utterances, interpret his sayings, love his apostles. Doesn't anybody else find it incongruous that not a single utterance from Jesus' teachings in the gospel accounts are found in Paul's many letters? For Paul, Jesus is just some divine Messiah who dies, resurrects, and we must trust in this fact. Apart from that, Jesus' teachings are completely absent in Paul. Peter thinks this is a major flaw. What Peter brings out in the Clementine homilies again can be corroborated by looking at Paul's writings. Paul admits in Galatians that after he was converted, he then began his work for 14 years before he ever went back to Jerusalem to learn from the apostles who knew Jesus. Galatians 2:1. By the way, he went to Asia. He went to Arabia, I think is what he said. I mean, he was in a nowhere place and nobody knows anything he did. It's called the Paul's mystery period. 14 uncounted years. A lot of Christians think he's working all the time. We have no idea what he's doing. Paul admits that until that time, he only had a brief 2-week visit to Jerusalem 3 years after his vision or the appearance account on the road to Damascus. Paul emphasizes his lack of contact with the 12 by pointing it out in those 2 weeks he only met Peter and then briefly James, the Lord's brother. Paul adamantly insists this is his sole encounter with the apostles within 14 years. Galatians 2:1. So listen to how he's extolling his ignorance, that it's best to not know anything from these people called the apostles. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb, to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the heathen, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood, that would be the apostles, neither went I up to Jerusalem to them which were apostles before me. So he's saying I'm avoiding contact with them because I don't want to learn anything from them. But I went into Arabia, oh yes, it was Arabia, and returned again unto Damascus. Then after 3 more years, how many years were we up to? And returned to Damascus, then after 3 years went into Arabia, and returned to Damascus, but I went unto Arabia, and returned again unto Damascus. Then after 3 more years I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter, and abode with him 15 days. But other of apostles I saw none, save James the Lord's brother. Now the things which I write you, behold, before God, I lie not. By the way, what did Jesus say? Whenever you say before God I lie not, don't do that. That comes from evil. Because you're trying to use God's name to say, see, I'm not lying to you, and I'm telling you in God's name, I'm not lying. Jesus says that's an horrific, wrong thing to do. But he does it repeatedly. Afterwards, I came into the regions of Syria and Cilicia. So Peter in the Clementine Homily in 17 thus asks a very good question. If Jesus spent a year or more with the apostles after the resurrection teaching them, Jesus obviously did so in order that their witness would be full and superior to others. Then it was incumbent on Paul to learn from them. Yet by Paul's own admission, Paul fails to do so for years. How then can Paul form the greater part of New Testament scripture when his ideas are not based on Jesus' teachings? Isn't that a red flag right there? Christianity is being expounded by someone who never spent any extended time with Jesus, never trained under him, and whose writings are devoid of utterances of Jesus except a small, unique aphorism, and that's in the book of Acts, where it says, it's better to give than receive, as the Lord said. That's it. And only one inaccurate quote from the Lord's Supper account. So that's where he quotes Luke, and he messes that up too. Other respected thinkers have been astonished by Paul's lack of mentioning any lessons of Jesus. Albert Schweitzer once said, where possible, Paul, avoids quoting the teachings of Jesus, in fact, even mentioning it. If we had to rely on Paul, we should not know that Jesus taught in parables, had delivered the Sermon on the Mount, had taught his disciples the Our Father. Even where they are especially relevant, Paul passes over the words of the Lord. A modern Christian scholar, Hans von Koppenhausen, agrees this deficiency in Paul's writings is a striking and glaring problem. The most striking feature is that the words of the Lord, which must have been collected and handed on in the primitive community and elsewhere from the earliest days, played no, or at least no, vital part in Paul's basic instruction of his churches. So Peter's point in the Clementine homilies is likewise that Paul's failure to teach what Jesus teaches is the clearest proof that Paul is not following Jesus. It is a point well taken. So you can see the battle lines are drawn. Paul, you're not following Jesus, follow us. Listen to us. We know what we're talking about. You don't know anything. and you don't want to know anything, change your mind. Follow us. Listen to him. Love his apostles. Love our teachings. You'll learn what the Lord Jesus teaches you, and he doesn't want anything to do with that. And he tells the Galatians, I don't want to know anything from them. I have my own revelations. Okay, I think that's, well, maybe we'll read one more thing that you can just get a flavor of what's really going on. So there's a letter of Peter to James. This is part of the Ebionite writings. This was preserved by even the Roman Catholic Church, so they didn't destroy all these things. This was the original preface to the Clementine homilies, Peter to James. For some among the Gentiles have rejected my lawful preaching, and have preferred a lawless and absurd doctrine of a man who is my enemy. And indeed, some have attempted, while I am still alive, to distort my word by interpretation of many sorts, as if I taught the dissolution of the law. But that may God forbid, for to do such a thing means to act contrary to the law of God, which was made to Moses and was confirmed by our Lord in its everlasting continuance. For he said, for heaven and earth will pass away, but not one jot or tittle shall pass away from the law. Letter of Peter to James 2.3-5, presumed to be about 92 AD. Okay, so it's very clear that there is a deep, deep divide between Peter and Paul at this point. This is something that's, of course, hushed up, but you're going to see it more clearly when we now will get closer to see what the Dead Sea Scrolls teach in the next section. Okay, so what we've done so far is shown you what you would be able to conclude without the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then we're going to show you now that first we're going to show you all the documentation was destroyed deliberately. So, for example, even the Clementine homilies, Rufinus saved them by just simply translating out the words for Paul and adding in trifold blessedness for baptism so that it would look like the Trinity was in existence in the first century. Other than those changes, he preserved it, and then he threw away the Clementines, the original documents that could have verified what the distortions and corruptions were by Rufinus. And unfortunately anyway, point is, we will find there's systematic destruction, and only the Dead Sea Scrolls are going to bring to life certain parts of their existence. So why do we not know about the true views about these people? The Ebionite works were not preserved in any library anywhere. Imperial Rome, beginning with Theodosius' reign, 379 to 395, outlawed any religion but that of the bishops of Rome. Through the entire empire. You can't have any other religion. So there was no freedom of religion anymore. We were tolerated, but we're not going to tolerate anybody else anymore. So we learned our lesson. No, we didn't. We were being hypocrites. So we were happy to have freedom of religion before this time and let other people have freedom of religion, but now we're going to take it away from other people. And that's what Theodosius did. He's the most vicious of all the Roman emperors in his brutality and killing and censorship. And he's the one who, that's when the Trinity was first created, is under Theodosius. It didn't exist beforehand. It was a bi-deity. Jesus was co-God, co-creator, and that was that. But Theodosius is the one who brought in the idea of a third God to be in the Godhead. Okay, so now how did he enforce this? He enforced this by the destruction of both public and private libraries in the Roman territories. If any heretical material was found, the owner suffered the death penalty. This suppression of historical works was interpreted broadly. For example, in 371, Emperor Valens ordered troops to remove from private homes at Antioch, Syria, work on liberal arts and the law, not just heretical works. Quote, discouraged and terrorized people all over the eastern provinces of the empire, wishing to avoid any possible suspicion, began to burn their own libraries. There's a footnote. This grew worse under Theodosius. Then in 435 and 438, the emperors of Rome again commanded the public burning of unorthodox books throughout the empire. How could the Ebionites survive with all this hatred? And because they were not Trinitarians, they didn't want to be, nobody would preserve their works. So effective were these decrees that there was not one single record written by an Ebionite that we can find preserved anywhere in any library. Think about it. A group that was a major movement. And when you see the Dead Sea Scrolls and how much their Ebionite writings are there, you're going to go, wow, this is huge. that in one little cachet, we're undoing all this historical censorship. We know them only through the interpretation of their enemies. Our only records on the Ebionites' views are what the Roman government authorities allowed to escape from the fire, because the Ebionites' writings were quoted in the approved writings of Eusebius and Epiphanius. And by the way, one thing you need to consider is maybe Eusebius and Epiphanius weren't as hostile as you really think they were. They were preserving the viewpoints of the early church in maybe the hopes that people like us, like me, like people who are objective, would see that there was extreme pressure on Eusebius and on Epiphanius to come out with saying these hostile things, when really all they're trying to do is preserve memory of what the early church thought, because if they don't put it down, it would be completely eradicated. So sometimes we need to know there's another reason why these people could be doing that. So I actually believe, I'm convinced that Eusebius was writing things to just preserve them for us. Epiphanius maybe not, but Eusebius was not a true believer in a lot of stuff he was putting there. For example, he was Arian. He was not Trinitarian, but he made it look like for a long time he would write like he was Trinitarian. But when it came down to it, he tried to convince Constantine to allow Arianism, basically the belief that Jesus is not God. So, okay, anyway. Okay, but now we have a fortuitous discovery of Ebionite writings. Or is that all we now have about the Ebionites? Did the world recently discover a treasure trove of their writings from which we can objectively measure their orthodoxy? A good argument has recently been made by Professor Eisenman in James, the Brother of Jesus, that we have recovered some of the Ebionite readings among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, Eisenman, by the way, does this in multiple books, but this is my first exposure to it back in 2005. I think this is 2005. And so it was like, wow, this was a big deal to me, because this helped me. It helped unlock that, you know what, we shouldn't be so judgmental about the Ebionites. This gives us a different picture. Many of the sectarian works on the Dead Sea Scrolls are written by a group who in Hebrew call themselves the Ebionim or Ebion, the poor. They even describe themselves as the congregation of the poor. The poor of the Dead Sea Scrolls claim to be followers of, quote, believe it or not, the way, part of the, quote, new covenant, who found the, quote, Messiah. This is all from Eisenman, who is called the, quote, prince of the congregation, quote, and teacher of righteousness. He's gone, killed at the urging of the priests at Jerusalem. After the departure of the Messiah, who will return, the temporal leader who led the poor was called the Just One, or the Zaddik in Hebrew. I mean, if you should already be realizing that's James the Just, that he's called James the Just to mean the Zaddik in Hebrew would be the Just in English. Furthermore, their leader, the Zaddik, James, is in a struggle against the, quote, spouter of lies, guess who that might be, who seeks to seduce the new covenant community from following the law of Moses. The poor, or Ebion, reject the idea that Habakkuk 2:4 means justification is by faith and insist its meaning is justification by faithfulness. We'll have a whole series on that. That's actually correct. That's what Habakkuk 2:4 says. So we have our original, the original writings of our church are pointing right at Habakkuk 2:4 as not meaning what this person, the spouter of lies, says it means. The DSS Ebion have two writings, both called Justification by Works. That's the title of the document, which reaffirm the rejection of the position of the spouter of lies. I mean, when I was first reading this, I'm jumping up and down going, this is impossible. This is like out of a dream, like your fantasy of like, could we find a writing closer to the original apostles? Yes, but it's contrary to everything we believe. We believe Paul's inspired. We believe he's a true apostle of God. But wait a minute, who are these people? Who are the Ebion? And so that began my search, part of my search for who are they and are they legitimate? And that's how you get the other quotes. And so we're now hearing the other side of the story. I see. And by the way, this is why the Dead Sea Scrolls were being hidden so long by the Catholic authorities. And Eisenman, to his credit, dislodged it from their hands. And now the Catholics wanted all these scholars to say, this is an Essene community, this is an Essene covenant, this is a community rule. And that word Essene doesn't even appear anywhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the Ebion appear all the time in these writings by them themselves. See, so there was an entire effort to suppress even what was coming out and to reinterpret it before. They figured that even if it ever came out, if we saturated the marketplace with the viewpoint this was an Essene community, that would solve the problem, and we could then, nobody will remember that it turns out it was the Ebion. And unfortunately, Eisenman has been the one who first brought this out, and he's making money books on it, but profiting from it. But other people can't take credit for it, so it's sort of like it kind of left it in his corner, and he's the one doing all this, but all the others, Protestants don't want to bring this out, right? Eisenman's Jewish by background. He's okay with this, but all the other people are involved are just like the Catholics. They have the same desire to cover up and conceal what's there. So Eisenman is the only one we're getting any truth from in our own Protestant community. Won't touch this stuff. But let's keep going. When we compare the Ebion of the Dead Sea Scrolls to what Eusebius describes as the Ebionites, the similarities are striking. This Christian sect of Ebionites seemed to match the writings of the poor Ebionim, whose writings were found at the Dead Sea site of Qumran. These Dead Sea Scrolls reflect ideas and thoughts that are unmistakably Christian. Now, by the way, I'm going to quickly tell you something. Originally, the other thing the Catholic authorities did is they created a hypothesis that this was a script writing area, right? And there was all these books. The explanation why all these books are here was because it was a community, an Essene community out in the desert, writing and copying all these books, 6, 7 copies of Isaiah, 6 and 7 copies of Hosea, all these books, and collecting all the ideas of other groups like the Ebion, and there were a lot of other sects in there, not just traditional or Orthodox sects. So it turned out that it was completely wrong. It wasn't a scriptorium at all. And so Golb wrote a book that became the definitive explanation. And again, this is sort of forgotten, but he proved it beyond doubt that when the Romans were sieging Jerusalem, this actually kind of was building up between 68 and 70 AD. So those people used the Herodian tunnel underneath the temple to go all the way out and bring all the library of Jerusalem out because they could see the siege was coming. Thank God they did, because the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. It would have destroyed all of the writings of the Jewish people, all their Bibles. They carried it all the way out, took it to the driest desert they could find, put it in caves where it could last millennia, which it did. And the evidence of that is multiple-fold, is the idea that there were a lot of plates there originally was interpreted to mean that there were monks living there, and it must have been a large community, about 50, 60 people. Well, it turned out it was a clay plate factory, and they can reconstruct the complete factory, so it had nothing to do with a monk community. And there were no clips for copying, so you would put a clip on the piece of paper so you can make sure you stayed on a line. None of those clips were there, and you would expect that in a scriptorium. And also the coinage on the ground. So coins fall out of people's pockets, or they drop them when they're paying somebody money, whatever. They were all over the place, and they were from 63, 64, 67 AD, upright, So you could just see these are people coming there with these coins, with their workload of bringing the scrolls there. And then that explains why you have so many copies of everything. Why would people have 7 copies of Isaiah? And beautifully well done. And some of these things go back to the 350s. So they had documents from 350, 300, 250. So this is what you could expect in 68 AD. These are not yet that old enough to be, crumbling. So anyway, long story short is that's why the Dead Sea Scrolls are there. It's not a community that lived there. It was the temple library brought from Jerusalem underground out and then caravanned all the way down to the Dead Sea, to Qumran. And that's the right answer to that. Okay, I think, I wanted to give you some quotes from these things. Well, I gave you some quotes already. And here's Golb's argument. I talk about that here in this article. And then we talk about, does the Dead Sea Scrolls depict the trial of Paul? So let's go there. I'm going to stop this now, pause it, and we'll start there. Okay, so again, this is chapter 12 of Jesus Words Only. So if you want to find it, you can go to jesuswordsonly.github, github.io, and then look for the books, and then look for Jesus Words Only, and then go to chapter 12. You can read it in more detail. And it's free. Do the Dead Sea Scrolls depict the trial of Paul? What is highly intriguing is a further theory of Professor Eisenman about Paul. He claims the Poor's writing, the Ebion's writings in the DSS, Dead Sea Scrolls, speak of a trial of Paul. He says James is depicted as Paul's key antagonist in a heated confrontation where Paul spoke vigorously against James. Paul's effort was viewed as an attempt to split the group. Eisenman bases this on 2 DSS writings. First is the Habakkuk Pesher, a commentary on Habakkuk 2, verse 4, a favorite verse of Paul. The DSS author interprets the verse, however, to require faithfulness for salvation. The Pesher then rejects the idea that justification is without adding works to faith. Professor Eisenman sensibly asks, how can we credibly believe this pressure on Habakkuk 2:4 is directed at anyone else than Paul? As we shall see next, the DSS poor are up in arms about the, quote, spouter of lies who opposes the Zadik, the just one. Are we to believe it is merely coincidence again the Ebion of the DSS just so happened to want to show Habakkuk 2 verse 4, one of Paul's favorite proof texts, it's twice in Romans and Galatians, does not stand for an idea that Paul alone is known to have espoused? I mean, no one in history ever misinterpreted Habakkuk 2 verse 4 before to be about justification by faith, okay? And remember, it's not even justification by faith of you or me. It's justification by the faithfulness. Not even that. It's the just shall live by the faithfulness of the evil one that's depicted in the prophecy of the evil one in Habakkuk 2 verse 3 through 8, 9, 10, meaning the steadfastness of the person that is really the opponent of Messiah. So there's some quality in that person that has some meritorious quality to it, somebody who's willing to, go work hard for his views, even though he's completely an evil person. So it was sort of a call to emulate certain good qualities of this bad person who has an evil spirit and evil intentions and so on. It's just one of those ironic passages in Scripture. Okay. So back to this. Are we to believe it's mere coincidence again that the Ebionite of the Dead Sea Scrolls just so happen to want to show Habakkuk 2:4, one of Paul's favorite proof texts, does not stand for an idea that Paul alone is known to have espoused? Eisenman concludes we are clearly witnessing deconstruction of Paul's doctrines in the DSS Ebionite material. It is the next document found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is the key document to identify Paul as the object of a trial by the poor, the Ebionim. This faith works discussion of the Habakkuk Pesher continues in a work by the poor entitled the Damascus Document. It says the contrary view, unquote, works justification is held by the, quote, spouter of lies who resists the Zadik. I mean, come on. This is really obvious, right? The spouter of lies seeks to have the congregation of the new covenant, and that's in quotes, that's actually the words in the book, depart from the law. A heated public confrontation occurs between the Zadik and the spouter of lies. You can find this Damascus document in any of the many compendiums of the DSS to verify this yourself. Professor Eisenman claims this Damascus document is too uncanny a reference to Paul and James to claim it reflects a pre-Christian debate. It appears Professor Eisenman has the better case on this point as well. The DSS scholars who initially dominated the field tried to maintain this Damascus document is a pre-Christian document. They did so to serve their now discredited all-encompassing Essene theory. They ignored the contrary internal evidence in the Damascus document itself. This is one of the very few DSS documents that were found long before the 1950s and outside the Dead Sea area. When the Damascus document was originally found in Egypt in the 1890s, its contents led preeminent historians to regard it as what? A Christian writing. George Margaluth of the British Museum said in 1910 and 1911 that the Damascus document was written around the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, near 70 A.D., correct to the T, right, ladies and gentlemen? That's a perfect dating, and was the work of Sadducean Christians of Damascus. Sadduceans would be people who do what? Not people just who you might think don't believe in eternal life. No, the Sadducees were known as being a certain character. What was that? They would not amend or teach anything that wasn't expressly found in Scripture, in the holy writings. So the Pharisees would come up with all kinds of fables and stories and all this stuff and make it just as important as the Word of God. But the Sadducees were strict that you can't do that. You have to stick right by the Word. So that seems to be what that aspect of the Sadducees is what led the people reading the Damascus document to conclude it's Sadducean Christians. So just so you know, that proves objectively that if you didn't have the DSS prejudice that these writings all, which the Catholic Church was very happy to make you think were all pre-Christian writings, that you have an objective proof that that's not true. Because if you didn't have that prejudice created by the Catholic myth that this was all a community pre-Christ, you would have concluded even just this one document itself would have convinced you this is Christians. The way they're talking about a Messiah, New Covenant, The Zadik, maybe the spouter of lies. You don't like hearing that, but you'd have to go. Maybe there's some. It doesn't say the word Paul, so maybe in 1910, 1911, they were okay just to say this is a Christian document. We can see right on his face. All right, let's keep going. Margulis' opinion was given long before the DSS discovery at Qumran in the 1950s. It antedated by 40 years the premature fixation on Essenes of 200 BC as the authors of the Damascus document. This fact proves an objective assessment of the Damascus document would lead to a different result. One would conclude objectively it is a work of Christians known as the poor who were zealous for the law, the Zadokites, or Sadducean. That's another way of saying the Sadducees were saying we are going to follow the word of God strictly, Sadduceans or Sadduceans. We can also see this for ourselves. The Damascus document identifies the community as the poor, or Ebion in Hebrew. They followed the Zadik, a label which independent and reliable sources prove was the moniker of James. The enemy of the poor was the spouter of lies who sought to seduce the New Covenant community from following the law. The New Testament evidence strongly suggests that Paul was accused of lying about his apostleship, and Paul knew this. The New Testament evidence likewise demonstrates the Jerusalem church under James was known as the poor. Romans 15, verse 26, Galatians 2, verses 9 to 10, as even Jerome said. Early church evidence also demonstrates a group called Ebionites, which is a transliteration meaning the poor, were Christians who felt Paul was seducing wrongly the Christian community from following the law. Professor Eisenman thus has the better case on the Christian era aspect of the Damascus document. Then, if he is correct on its meaning, the DSS depiction of the poor, the Ebion, perfectly and uniquely matched the Ebionites of whom Eusebius spoke. Do you realize what that's saying? Is we have now been able to connect what Eusebius and Epiphanius are both saying about a group called the Ebionites are actually our apostles. And they're writing down the conflict between James, the spouter of lies, and one of their rebuttals to him is to do a commentary on the book of Habakkuk to specifically address this mistranslation Paul made of Habakkuk 2 verse 4, which I put inside of my five episode videos on the book of the prophecy against Paul in the Habakkuk in the book of Habakkuk. So please look for those. I think you'll find those fascinating. It then follows the Ebionites must be orthodox. They are to be equated with the Jerusalem church of the poor under James. Eusebius must have engaged in distortion of their beliefs to serve his agenda of the 300s. Since that time, I've concluded that he was deliberately trying to look orthodox from Constantine's weird pagan view, and to what he had to do is take any group that was not Trinitarian, which were the Ebionites, is he had to vilify them or else he would be in trouble with his boss, Constantine, because this is what he wanted. He wanted this to be three gods that would match exactly his pagan pantheon, where there was God Horus, there was God the Sun, which is Sol Invictus, and there was the mother Isis or Easter. Her name also was Easter in the Celtic language, and it had to be that Trinity. Was his own personal Trinity was that Trinity, and he wanted our Trinity to match his exactly. So you had to have Mary, Mother of God. You had to have Horus was now the Father in heaven, and then Jesus would now be Sol Invictus, for the Christians. And then they had to line up on the same days of worship and so on and so forth. I mean, anybody who doesn't see this, well, anyway, we'll do a whole thing on Constantine. We'll show you how obvious that is too. Okay, so Eusebius' purpose is self-evident. He wanted to discredit the Ebionites. Okay, again, I think he was doing it to please his boss, Constantine, because of the centrality of Paul to the validity of the Roman Catholic Church. Many forget that after Peter's presumed founding of the church at Rome, it was Paul who had appointed the first bishop of Rome, Linus, of the Roman Catholic Church. So that's a fact. So Peter didn't have to come in and say, I'm bishop of Rome. He's an apostle. To be bishop would be a downgrade, right? So who is the actual first bishop of Rome? Well, it was Linus. Who appointed him? Paul. So the Roman church that became the corrupt one under Constantine, totally corrupt, was founded by Paul, not by Peter, unfortunately. Today we call this Bishop of Rome the Pope. However, the Ebionites claim Paul was to be ejected from canon is inconsistent with Jesus' position on the law. If the Ebionites were right, this means the RCC was corrupted by Paul shortly after Peter founded the Roman Church. So Peter did start the church first. Eusebius had no choice but to attack the Ebionites, regardless of their high standing in the church's recent memory. In fact, that high standing explains why Eusebius attacked them so vigorously. Let me just pause this here for a minute. Okay, I'm just going to, this is an illustration of something. So some people believe it's inconceivable Eusebius could knowingly disparage the Jerusalem church under James as legalists. Okay, so he definitely is disparaging them, right? So it could be he was either like a double agent, really a pro-Ebionite person, but he has to say all these things to be able to survive under Constantine's evil empire, or did he knowingly do this? And so I'm trying to show, yes, there are Christians who are so wed to Paul, they will attack the 12 apostles and James. So I gave an example of that, and it's this Christian journal called The New Birth, condemning freely the Jerusalem church of the 12 apostles and James. And just listen to the hate coming off the page. At the true apostles of Jesus Christ, the gospel of the Jerusalem church becomes a perverted gospel. Whoa, right off the bat, perverted. Once the law covenant was fulfilled and set aside as the governing covenant economy. Well, where did we get that? Jesus didn't do that. And the Jerusalem church would not accept this fact. Yeah, because they're loyal to Jesus, but continued stubbornly trying to keep the law covenant. Yes, because their master told them to. It will be explained in this article that trying to keep both the law covenant along with the new covenant perverted the gospel of Christ. That's what you say because you're following a person who doesn't even know Jesus Christ, so, sir. That's these are my annotations. And annulled both covenants. Wow. They perverted the gospel of Christ and annulled both covenants. So they annulled the old and the new by following the gospel of Jesus preached. That's weird. It was necessary for the Lord to take Paul out into the wilderness apart from all the others and teach him directly the pure gospel of Christ, because the gospel of the Jerusalem church was now a perverted gospel. How many times did he call it a perverted gospel? 3 times. This is in an article called First Sonship of Christ, The New Birth, February 2000, Volume 25, number 2. Hold on a minute. I just want to pause. All right. In closing, I just want to make one more point about the Saturday Sabbath, and then I'm going to make some final remarks. So the fact of the matter is that the church was following Sabbath continuously from the early Ebionites all the way up to 363, when they had to outlaw it and make it a heresy and a curse and an anathema to rest on the Saturday Sabbath. This is Roman Catholicism does this. This is not true of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which retains Sabbath and does retain it worldwide except in the USA. So somebody corrected me one time and I had to research it, and yes, it's true. The USA says no, you don't have to follow Sabbath, but the Eastern Orthodox of the rest of the world says you should rest on Sabbath. That doesn't mean you don't go to church on Sunday. It just means you rest on Sabbath. So that's what the Constitution of the Apostles said was the correct message from the Apostles as well. Okay, so what's the final remarks? So we have here a miracle. So I'm always told that the proof that the Ebionites are wrong are simply they didn't exist. I mean, they didn't survive. They got outlawed. They got censored. The writings were destroyed. They had no more influence. So God didn't bless them anymore. Now, look at it from the Ebionites' perspective. Jesus told us that the law doesn't go away until the heavens and earth go away. So they follow that. They keep the Sabbath, which actually is in Isaiah that Gentiles have to keep the Sabbath too for salvation purposes, and then avoid evil. But the Jews would have to follow more than that maybe. But that would be clearly, the Sabbath has to be central. But Paul says it's gone. So should they worry about whether they're going to survive or not, or be censored because they're following Jesus' words? No, they have to go down the whole path. You got to stay on a narrow road. That may mean there's very few of you, and it may mean you could be wiped out. It means you could be censored into oblivion. But God's going to do something that's going to basically protect you in the end. And it's weird, but in a sense, they've resurrected. Why? Because now they're speaking to us through the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I have a feeling that I'm not the only person who's read Eisenman. I'm not the only person who said, hey, this made me think twice about Paul, right? So Eisenman is saying this sect concluded that Paul was the spouter of lies, that he was adverse to the Zadik and to the apostles. Okay, so Eisenman is educating us that there is a freedom to now say, hey, these people have been resurrected. We can now follow what they're saying, and we can hear the other side of the story, and we can we can say, what are their principles? What did they teach? And Eusebius and Epiphanius, for all of what they said, they also preserved the teachings of these people. Okay, so they didn't believe in a Trinity. They didn't believe in a virgin birth. Okay, are those game changers that we have to reject them? Because truly, there is no Trinity mentioned in the Bible. Jesus says in 17:3, he addresses the Father as the only true God. Look at John 17, verse 1 to 3. So that lines up with the Ebionite position. And the virgin birth, that, well, if we have a virgin birth, Jesus isn't the heir of David. So I don't know how that would work for us. So maybe we need to explore the virgin birth. Maybe there's some truth that we got lost because of all the defeat of the Ebionites. In other words, there was some adverse position being taken trying to destroy our manuscripts, that maybe there was a virgin birth initially. So let's keep an open mind about that issue. Okay, so we'll go into that soon. We'll take a look at that. Is there a possibility? Because otherwise Jesus can't be Messiah if he isn't a true Davidic heir. And so there's theories of how he could still be a Davidic heir even if Joseph wasn't his father, but they seem pretty weak. But we'll look at that. And but anyway, we do have a resurrection of the Dead Sea of the Ebionites through the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we now have a way of looking at it. I think one of the other things that's very interesting is their view on Habakkuk 2 verse 4. So they wrote the Habakkuk Pesher. We cited that in our series. We have a 5-part series on the Habakkuk chapter 2. Verses, I think it's 2 or 3 through 12, and then I think verse 20. So take a look at that. That shows you that's a prophecy about Paul, okay, in the negative. But there was a dispute that Paul was trying to take one verse out of context and say this means the just, the righteous shall live by faith, just a belief, not a actual faithfulness or steadfastness of any kind. And so the Habakkuk Pesher is saying that this is false, and they've countered this person. And as I mentioned in that other series, there is evidence that they believe that Paul actually fulfilled the negative part of Habakkuk chapter 2. See, so that 5-part series also corroborated that position of the Ebionites. So they were really quite astute biblically, meaning they were looking very carefully. If you don't look at Habakkuk 2, and you just take one verse out of context, you don't realize it's a prophecy about a very evil man coming who's the adversary of Messiah, who will, teach against God's law, who will be full of pride. He'll try to gather all the Gentile nations to himself to try to defeat the Messiah. But you see, Messiah can't be defeated, and that's what I think the Dead Sea Scrolls represent. They're Dead Sea Scrolls that include not just the Bible, but the writings of the Ebion, and they have now had their second light. And let me make one last point, is had Eisenman not legitimized looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls about the Ebion is about our original church, they would have been truly dead. But he is Jewish. And unlike the Catholics and the Protestants, who both connive to never tell you that the original church is right there in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they'll never tell you. They'll bring you to seminars to show you, hey, let's look at the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit here in San Diego, and there'll only be books of the Bible, books meaning, Isaiah or whatever. But the Ebion writings, which were a significant part of what was recovered in the Dead Sea, is never put on display and is never talked about by Protestants or Catholics, because it's not good news for them. It shows that we have gotten off the beam, that the Protestantism and long ago Catholicism went away from the Ebionite position, got rid of Sabbath day rest, got rid of the law, got rid of the 10 Commandments are no longer applicable to us. We live in a different dispensation, all this stuff. Now God is bringing to light the Ebionites again. And so this whole argument that they got defeated is proof that they were not of God has been refuted. And they are, I believe, they are the original church, and they were of God, and they were of Christ. It's this whole movement we've been living in, which is not of God, not of Christ, and in fact is actually happy about this. Happy we're not following the Jesus of the Gospels. They're happy that we're following Paul. It's just so mind-boggling. Anyway, I hope this helps educate us that where we are in time in history is a very big epic that but for the Dead Sea Scrolls being exposed and but for Professor Eisenman's pointing that they're about Paul, I don't think this movement would have ever come off the ground. So it literally is God is the one who's directing this whole movement to look at Paul over again and make sure that we test him the way the way the original church did, look at the original findings of the church and see if that's not reasonable, and then go with it, and then stick with Jesus, stick with his gospel, stick with the lessons the Ebionites have for us. So I hope this edified everybody, and God willing, we'll have a great exposition on in the future of what Jesus' teachings are all about. And so that's where people's focus will be, and Paul will be a forgotten page of history. It can happen, God willing. All right, take care. God bless. Ciao.